Meeting to order. This is the Thursday, February 10th meeting of the House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Today's focus is on broadband, and we have two presenters today, Court Buffington from CanRen and Stanley Adams from the Kansas Department of Commerce. So committee, if you have questions about things broadband, this is the day to get them out. And we'll see if there's more that we need to study after we get through our presentations today. So with that, I will welcome Court Buffington, Executive Director of CanRen, to the committee. Court, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Chairman Finch, members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak with you today about some aspects of broadband. I'm going to focus today on a little bit of a subset of the broadband issue because we hear a lot about some parts. I want to talk about anchor institution broadband and what broadband means to anchors, and it's going to have a bit of an emphasis on higher education and larger anchors. And our telecom industry in the state, the Department of Commerce, there's been a huge amount of focus on residential broadband. I don't want any of you to think that I don't believe that's important. That is extremely important, and that is our 900-pound gorilla. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about an aspect that I think and our community believes is a little bit underrepresented, and that in a complete broadband solution, there is more than just last mile and residential and small business services. To understand a bit about what CanRen is and where we come from in the context of this, I wanted to provide a little bit of the briefest of all histories. CanRen is an acronym. It stands for Kansas Research and Education Network. ARNI networks exist pretty much across the entire United States. Many of us have been here since the dawn of the internet. And our goal has always been to provide for primarily higher education. In the beginning, it was research universities, and we moved down the stack into community colleges, over time moving into K-12 public libraries. And today we even serve some local and county governments. CanRen is one of the oldest ARNI networks in the nation. We are also one of the smallest. In many states, for a variety of reasons, the state government has chosen to directly fund the ARNI effort. That's not something that Kansas, and Kansas is not alone, has chosen to do, which is kind of owing to our smaller size. I said there are ARNI networks across the entire United States. I wanted to share an image of what all of our networks look like hooked together. In fact, all together, we have an organization we call the Quilt because we look kind of like a patchwork quilt connecting the entire nation. Our networks tend to be interconnected with each other, and in a loss of the public internet, we actually comprise a nationwide backbone amongst ourselves. We talk a lot in the broadband landscape about digital divides, especially homework gaps and residential small business divides, oftentimes in rural areas, but there is also an institutional divide. Most of the programs, well, pretty much all of the programs we see, the Broadband Acceleration Program from the Department of Commerce, myriad funding under Spark, and future programs, along with the telecom industry, have made huge strides and continue to improve the broadband situation in the state. But those programs are almost entirely focused around providing residential services and small business services. Clearly, that's the area of largest need. But as I said earlier, to have a comprehensive broadband infrastructure in our state that meets all of our needs, there are other things that we need to not forget about. Most importantly, access and affordability means something different in an institutional setting than they do in a residential setting. Many anchor institutions, most critically higher education, some of these things I'm going to talk about also affect our last mile providers in the state as they begin to solve the broadband problem and really get service out there to all of the areas that are underserved now. There are going to be issues. As soon as we get that accomplished, we're going to start looking at problems with capacity, reliability, and resiliency in our infrastructure at the state level. What do I mean by that? The majority of connectivity in Kansas today is dependent on downtown Kansas City, Missouri. Just a few years ago, there was one fiber cut. It was actually a break due to ice and conduit that took an alarming amount of broadband services throughout the entire state offline. I want to make sure that we're considering things like this as we build out state infrastructure so that when we have that last mile served adequately, we also have the middle mile and the statewide infrastructure necessary to make sure it's resilient and reliable. In higher education, oftentimes those institutions tend to be looked at as a customer in a town, a pretty big one. But I would say that a higher education institution is more of a town unto itself when you look at all of the things that those institutions provide. In fact, a quick look, CANON is a 501c3, so we're governed by a governing board of directors from our membership. My boss this year, our board chair, is the CIO of Barton Community College in Great Bend, Barton County. So I did a quick look. Barton Community College's student, staff, and faculty numbers are significantly larger than my hometown of Frontenac, Kansas. These institutions really are communities unto themselves. They have residential users. They have residence halls. That's different than the connectivity that they provide to faculty and staff and academic departments. They have healthcare on campus. They're all providing for healthcare needs of their students. They have related operations that are often third party. When you look at how bookstores commonly, food service is usually handled, those are usually third party commercial operations that operate on the campus that the campus has to provide service for as well. Internet service is just one service that's provided by broadband infrastructure. And I want to make this distinction really clear to you all, because broadband infrastructure and internet service are commonly viewed as one and the same. Internet service is something that is enabled with broadband infrastructure, but broadband infrastructure does much more than just internet service. It provides data transport services. That's point to point. Why is that important? Satellite campus, remote offices. Oftentimes, to ensure those remote entities are secure, the institution would like to transport data from the remote directly back to the main campus or a main location, and then provide internet access out of that location. Running that kind of connectivity through the internet has a great deal of security and performance problems. So data transport services run over broadband. Access to dark fiber, that's the lowest level. That is broadband infrastructure, is fiber optic cable in the ground. That is the most secure way to move data from one point to another, and it's also the most reliable and most resilient. I've been doing this involved in R&D networking for 26 years, and one of the issues with lit service that we commonly see is maintenance that needs to be done. I mean, it's understandable. We all have to maintain our networks. But those maintenance windows are almost always from midnight until 6 a.m., sometimes several nights a week. A college or university campus doesn't shut down after business hours. And a lot of critical services, such as disaster recovery and backups that are running out of that campus to another location, have to happen during the lowest hours of usage, which are usually around 3 to 6 a.m. It really hurts that institution's ability to be resilient and know that they've got those backups ready at a moment's notice if they have to deal with maintenance on a lit service. So this is a reason that they will look towards things like dark fiber, which does not have electronics on top that needs to be maintained. Well, it does, but the institution itself is maintaining that so they can coordinate the outages. It really isn't just about bits per second anymore. When we talk about a holistic view of infrastructure in the state and providing all of the broadband services we need for Kansas to be competitive in all aspects into the future, we can't just focus on bits per second and faster internet service. We have to focus on all of the components necessary. I'd like to finish up with a concrete example. I've spoken in a lot of generalities, and I'd like to give you one really good example, and it's one of my favorites because it involves something that's relatively new. We've all heard about the cloud, right? And sometimes it's hard to even understand exactly what the cloud means. Cloud services are really just moving something you have at some level off of your premises and locating it elsewhere with a third party that's operating the same or similar services at a very large scale. This allows them to achieve a lot of economies in that scale, make the service more cost-effective, more reliable, all the things you'd expect by aggregating more services together of the same kind. And we see a lot of this across the board. People are moving to cloud. You hear all the time, move to cloud. There are three main things cloud does. There's software as a service. That's where someone else is running the software, and the user just accesses that software somewhere else in the cloud remotely. There's platform as a service. Think of that like Windows. Someone's running the computer and the operating system somewhere else, and then the purchaser of the service, the user, gets access to the operating system to install and maintain applications that they use. And then there's infrastructure as a service. This is where the cloud provider is operating the bare metal hardware, and the user buys CPU time on a large cluster of computers and storage arrays so that they can install their own operating system, their own applications. To make matters even more complicated, many software as a service providers are actually out buying infrastructure as a service from the IaaS providers. So all of this stuff gets moved up. Why is this important in broadband? This is one of the key points I want to make. When we see our public institutions, again, higher ed chief amongst them because I've helped several higher eds in the state make their cloud transitions, when they move these critical services out into the cloud, I mean, we've all dealt with internet problems. You call your provider, they figure it out. Hey, it's not us, it's somewhere else. Maybe try contacting the person on the far end, the website or service you're trying to use, and you contact them, and they're like, yeah, we're good too. And then you find out there are a half a dozen or more intermediate providers between point A and point Z. And we've all had this frustration. You can't pick up the phone and call 1-800-INTERNET and ask them to fix it. Once you get out of the first provider for the service you're getting to and where you are, there really isn't anything you can do. One of the things that CANON is focused on to try to lead this charge for effective cloud migrations is to provide the entire path from the one endpoint to another. And I'm happy to say we've done that for several institutions already that buy services from, hopefully you've heard things like AWS, Amazon Web Service, Microsoft Azure. So we're able to provide direct connections from the campus or City Hall all the way into these service providers where it takes a maximum of maybe 4 people at one time on the phone to can control every aspect of that connectivity from end to end. This is a service that if we want these institutions to be absolutely reliable and up and running all the time does not work well over plain old internet service. Now, that's one thing they do. It's probably not the bulk of the data they move, but it also can be critically important, not only for schools to keep classes moving online, student information available, but also to provide things like e-government services. I worked hard to be brief. Thank you for the time again to present today. I'd be happy to stand for any questions, Chairman Finch. And also, my contact information is up here. Please feel free to contact me at any time. I also want to once again emphasize, by no means do I want to imply that the work that we're doing with last mile and residential service in the state is not important. It is extremely important. There just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of voice for the issues I'm talking about today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Questions for this conferee? Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just got a few, and I was looking at the regional networks map that you provided. So on the other slide where you got the anchor institution broadband needs, I'm just curious, to make this network up or for the use of the CANON services, you're stressing the internet's not the entire thing. I understand that, but to make that map work, are you using the internet for VPN services? In other words, how are we getting these connectivities? Are you running data transport? Is it public providers providing that, or are you providing your own? You running dark fiber? Just like to know a little more, if we could, how it's coming together.
A mix of all of them. VPN over the public internet does address many of the security concerns, not all of them, and it can be pretty effective. The better plain old internet service gets, the better VPN performs. The problem with VPN is with the extra overhead of a VPN, we start to see performance problems when getting to infrastructure as a service in particular, and availability and uptime isn't so great. We do a lot of lease transport services. We and anchor institutions, not everyone's part of CANREN. Most of the solutions we use are the same that those do on their own. A lot of data transport services, those tend to be better for those applications than internet. So if you've got an application that doesn't play well with public internet, tend to move to a transport service. And then for really ultra critical things or a lot of various needs aggregated together, especially if there's a large number of, well, large number in our world, that's a few institutions along a linear path, we find dark fiber to be the most cost effective and most reliable. Dark fiber tends to be priced by the route mile, so by distance. Lit services, transport services tend to be priced by the number of endpoints. So if you've got to go a very long distance, then lit services have typically better economy than dark fiber. And the trade-offs, dark fiber is always going to be the best. The trade-offs of the extra expensive dark fiber versus the aspects of lit service tending to not be as resilient make a good case for lit service. If you've got a larger number of stops along the way with dark fiber can become really cost effective. I might throw one other thing in here. When I talk about this is stuff we need, and we need to make sure that the funding that we're going to provide enables these other services as well. CANREN just received some RFP results back within the last week. In a location in downtown Topeka that we have been providing service in partnership with a carrier, the carrier's done a good job for us for the last 5 years. We wanted to move that lit service from 1 gigabit per second to 10 gigabits per second. So Topeka is not a small place. There are a lot of carriers that work here. It's an incumbent that we work with that's been here for decades. The price they gave us was $6,200 a month for 60 months. That is close to 3 times higher than we would expect to see in most states in the area, in the Central States region for a similar size metro and a similar type service. So the thing is, it's not, when I talk about access and affordability, here's a case where it is available, we can get the service, but it's not affordable. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and then within Kansas, are we using much private fiber as far as state-owned, or are we leasing IRUs, or how? Just curious how you're playing that out.
So publicly owned fiber is notoriously hard to get your hands on, even if you're another public agency that isn't the one that put the fiber in the ground. If you're a nonprofit like CANREN, it's next to impossible because we fall into a gap between being an agency and we're not a for-profit. Our member institutions have had difficulty getting access to existing public fiber. If I were to make a comment on the public fiber issue, I think the right thing for us to do as a state, and this includes fiber assets that the community that I work with holds. The University of Kansas has some, CANREN has some. We're not an agency, but we would happily put our assets in the pot. I think one of the things that's very important is that we view that is all publicly funded and publicly owned. It's not KU's fiber, it's not KDOT's fiber, it's fiber that belongs to the taxpayers of Kansas. And that should all be inventoried and made available in a way that's going to do the most for us.
And that's what I was driving toward. I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We've got a lot of folks who watch online, or at least I lie to myself and think it's a lot of folks who watch online, but for anyone watching, can you draw the distinction for us kind of at a very elementary level, difference between dark fiber and lit, and what we're really talking about in terms of wires in the ground or on poles, and give us kind of that 101 level?
Yes, sir. Happy to. And I'm going to be elementary, so I please don't be offended if I take it really low here. So the fundamental building block for all of this is dark fiber. And when I say dark fiber, I mean fiber optic cable that has no light on it. It's just strands of glass. It may be on poles, it may be in the ground. There's different business cases for whether you make it aerial or put it in the ground in different areas. Typically in the ground is considered the best, but I have seen places where on poles is actually better than in the ground. The next level up, you put light on the fiber. So you have something we call optronics. It's a combination of optical and electronics. So it's equipment with blinking lights on it that you plug into power and puts light on the cable. This creates the next level up. It creates logical links from one point to another point. You drop a bit of data in one end, it falls out the other. So we go from dark fiber that in and of itself does nothing to lit fiber, which is going to transport you from one exact location to another. And then when you start combining segments of lit service on top of fiber together with things called switches and routers, which is a term that we're all pretty familiar with now, and a few years ago we weren't, then you start building smarter logical layer on top that can make decisions at each of those endpoints on a lit segment about where the traffic will go next. The internet rides on top of those kind of decisions with routers and switches. The internet exists when multiple entities, and I'll use a paradigm of CANON and our neighbors because the internet is a really big place. So let's make a smaller one. So CANON uses a combination of dark fiber and lit services to build a backbone network. From that backbone network, we use the telecom industry for what we call access circuits to reach from our backbone out to end locations. The public universities are where our backbone co-locates. So any of those lit services or dark fiber segments don't do a lot on their own. Say the dark fiber that goes from Kansas City into KU and then KU to K-State. Well, all we can really do is send something towards K-State or from K-State towards KU. But when we start putting switching and routing on top of it, then we can switch and route past those locations to others. We have an interconnection with our friends in the South and friends in the East with Oklahoma and Missouri and Kansas City. So now CANON has a network that using lit services and dark fiber, we can switch and route traffic all around the state between our own members and what they do. And now with our interconnections to OneNet in Oklahoma and MoreNet in Missouri, called an autonomous system boundary. Impress your friends with that term. We can hop the autonomous system boundary over into MoreNet and they switch and route the traffic. So for example, if K-State's doing some work with University of Missouri-Columbia, we can switch and route that traffic directly between the organizations. And that is kind of a microcosm of the worldwide internet as a whole, which has, I'm trying to remember how many routes on the entire global internet. I believe it's well over one, it's in the millions at this point.
Thank you for that. Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Buffington. Recently, I just finished the book, The Codebreaker, about the development of CRISPR technology and gene editing. And in there, I was really amazed at how they used the internet to ship the information about genes, not only across the United States, like from Berkeley to the Broad Institute and MIT, but then also over to Germany. And they were able to keep working 24 hours a day because they'd ship their experiments over to Germany and they would continue the experiments over there and then ship it back, and they've just kept going, and it proved very beneficial, especially at the start of the pandemic, on identifying the virus and its genetic sequence. So with what you've described, and you did a good job within Kansas, and you have the map of nationally, but if we're going to be attached globally or connected globally, how does that interact with this network that you're talking about?
So we have a national network I didn't really speak much of. It's called Internet 2. The name is a little interesting. They were the original internet before there was a commercial internet. What were the group of institutions, the National Science Foundation, et cetera. So when the internet commercialized in the mid-90s, they went and created another one that they called Internet 2. It's a bit of a presumptuous name at times. Internet 2 is what is known as an NREN, a National Research and Education Network. I think every developed nation and a lot of emerging nations all have NRENs. And the NRENs are connected together much like I showed the R&E networks in states and regions of the United States. There are two major ways we do this. Internet 2 has some very large connections across the Atlantic into Europe, land in various locations. And there is a newer project called Pacific Wave, which is a bigger problem as the Pacific Ocean that fan out from both North and South America across into Asia and even down farther south. The overlay looks very similar, just moving to another set of institutions higher up. And those are problems. And I know they characterize that data transport as being internet. It is not. We see a fair amount of research. What we've seen mostly in the Great Plains region has been research with the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And so we see data sets that move back and forth from there fairly frequently. And all of that stuff, none of it's running over the public internet. It's running over NRENs and regional and state networks to get there. And I want to make a comment about how that data moves. The internet, what we all think of the internet, is very deterministic. That means you can easily predict exactly how much, well, not exactly, but very closely, how much traffic is going to exist on a link or on a path at a given point in time. This is something I answer a lot, especially when I'm talking to our providers in the telecom industry and they say, why do you need more bandwidth on this link? We were looking at our stats and you're barely using it. Internet service is very deterministic. You see it go up at times, certain times of the day, you see it go down, and it's made of thousands and hundreds of thousands of very small connections and sessions happening. When we start talking about things like large academic research projects, we see today 100 gigabit per second is about the minimum link size we see for those things. It may sit completely silent doing nothing for weeks on end. But then boom, when they need to transfer a data set from CERN, that thing pops up to 100 gigabits per second for 12 minutes and then back down to 0. But as I think you alluded to, the way this type of research happens, when that data needs to move, it has to move fast.
I think your book club's a little different than mine.
I thought he was going to ask me about genomics for a minute.
No, that's a different committee. We're on B is for burglar in my book club, but so Representative Gartner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Court, thanks for being here. Your last slide, it says, please ensure, the question is, or ensure that the money that Kansas invest in broadband infrastructure so everybody has access and affordability. From your perspective, what would you suggest? How should we be investing our money that we're receiving via infrastructure from the feds, et cetera?
A slight modification. It's not that we're doing anything wrong, but we see a lot of questions historically, and I know the broadband office, I work closely with Stanley. We spend probably way too much time together. Historically, the questions that we tend to ask about creating grants and the requirements that we put on them are based on last mile services to largely residential customers. And that's good. There is nothing wrong with that. But I believe we need to put a little more emphasis on also trying to ensure that things like dark fiber optic cable and transport services are also available at affordable prices. And those are questions we need to be asking in the application and proposal process.
Other questions? Leo, one more, and then we're going to move on.
Just a brief question here. You talked about I2. Is that running IPv6 or is it in the 4 days?
IPv6. Ooh, great question. IPv6 is a lot more prevalent today. So when you
Don't encourage him, Court.
I can do this street level, sir. So we all know about IP addresses, right? It's the whole thing that makes everything work. The problem with IP addresses is that we actually ran out several years ago. 4 billion wasn't nearly enough. Ratified almost 30 years ago was IP version 6 that nobody adopted, especially in developed nations. Honestly, the United States is probably the farthest behind globally, because we snagged the vast majority of IPv4 space back in the early days, and we've been bogarting as much of that as we can. Service providers are largely already adopted IPv6. At home, I live in Lawrence. I had Midco's cable service. Recently, AT&T brought dark fiber to my house. Thank you, AT&T. And I have a gigabit symmetrical fiber service. With both of those commercial providers, I had IPv6 available to me. So it's really become pretty commonplace out there now, but it doesn't get a lot of attention because IPv6 is happening slowly under the hood. You know, when you go buy a new computer with a modern operating system, IPv6 is enabled on it already. When I get the service from my residential providers, quietly IPv6 is sitting there on them running. But I'm a nerd, so I pay attention to this kind of stuff. Most of the traffic coming to my house right now comes in via IPv6 because my daughter is just addicted to Netflix and YouTube, and most of what we're bringing in from both of those are moving over IPv6 now.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Very informative presentation. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you, sir.
Up next this morning, we have Stanley Adams from the Kansas Department of Commerce. And Stanley's going to walk us through some of the state level initiatives that are going on at Spark. Stanley, thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just mention at the top, between Court's technical expertise and leisure reading for Representative Fibre reminds me of how little I know about the subject. So all questions technical, I will be deferring. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the opportunity to visit with you today. The past year has been a very busy one for us. Expanding broadband connectivity has never been more important than right now, as we have gone through a pandemic experience that I know you all are aware of. So today, I would like to just share with you an overview of the recent efforts that we have undertaken in the Office of Broadband Development to leverage federal funding in particular and improve access for all Kansans. And then I'll be happy to take questions, of course. So in terms of where we've been, the CARES Act in 2020, Federal Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, was enacted, and the Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansans Spark Committee was created. The Spark Committee allocated $60 million for broadband grant programs and related to our pandemic response. And we broke that up into two programs. The first was the Connectivity Emergency Response Grant Program. It was $50 million and was established to facilitate infrastructure deployments across the state. We encouraged local communities and internet service providers to work together in proposing projects where there was demonstrated need. The grants were competitive, and they featured a 20% matching contribution requirement. A total of 65 projects were funded across the state. The projects included both fiber and fixed wireless connectivity solutions. And this was done in very aggressive timing. I think I touched on that here. The program was established on an aggressive timeline. And the reason, what was going on there is that the CARES Act legislation originally required all of those funds that we received to be expended by December 30th of 2020. Ultimately, Congress extended the deadline for project completion. What was going on is there were supply chain delays nationwide, and it had definitely affected us here in Kansas, as well as poor weather during the period where these projects were being deployed. And that contributed to the need for an extension in a handful of cases in our state, but this was a national problem. Every opportunity I have, because of just how much work was required to get a large amount of work done in a compressed time period, I always like to thank the internet service provider community and commend them for the efforts that they took going above and beyond the call and getting this work completed, including having to do installations at the height of the pandemic, which is no easy task, and we're grateful for them and their work. You see here in the attachment, I've included a map. This is the 66 projects that we deployed, and I mentioned that they were a mix of fiber and fixed wireless. Some of them were hybrid. The key takeaway here is that we've got projects all across the state. These were competitive, as I mentioned, and let me point out to you at the back of the handout that I provided, I actually have the list so you can refer to all of the specific projects and where they were and how much the award was, how much the matching contribution and total investment was by project in our state. So that was the $50 million Connectivity Emergency Response Grant for infrastructure, essentially. And then we had a $10 million Broadband Partnership Adoption Grant program that we established, and that was to facilitate internet access for low-income households. The program defrayed to internet cost, funded hotspots, and provided devices to eligible households through that deadline period, December 30, 2020, per the CARES Act requirement. There were a total of 25 awards made under that program, and mostly those awards went to the internet service providers and school districts who facilitated the benefits to the households because they were in the best position to quickly identify where those low-income households were, and had established criteria for identifying households like the SNAP and the school lunch programs from an eligibility standpoint. And here, the map of the Partnership Adoption Grant programs, there's the 25 of them. You can see there's dispersed across the state as well, and the list of the specific awards is attached, but under at the end of the handout. So those were the two federally funded programs that we deployed, and it went into 2021, as I mentioned, for the project closeout and kind of getting all of the reporting and such done. And that kind of, what I wanted to do is just give you a little bit of a touch on some state-funded efforts that we have as well, which is the first time that we've had that. So we called it the Broadband Acceleration Grant program. It was launched in 2020, right after our pandemic response programs were deployed. The interesting note, the program is set for 10 years, $85 million it's what's called for, and it's designed towards going to bridge the digital divide in Kansas. This is, if you all are familiar, the program was funded through the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program, and it was created as a direct result of the funding provided through swift bipartisan action in the 2020 legislative session. So we were able to stand that. The legislation was passed before the pandemic, but then the pandemic hit, and we put the pandemic response programs up first, simply because of the order of magnitude and impact that we were going to be able to make with the $60 million versus the $5 million initial outlay. So to wit, under the Broadband Acceleration Grant Program, $5 million a year for each of the first 3 years is made available for grants, followed by 7 years of $10 million allocations for infrastructure. As I mentioned, this is the first state-funded broadband infrastructure grant program. The maximum amount for a single grant under the program is $1 million, and there is a 50% matching requirement on that program. So in effect, we are able to support projects costing up to $2 million to improve connectivity, making the total investment $10 million per year for the first 3 years. Is the way we set the program up. And I can go into any amount of detail you like, but the application process for the BAG program, the Broadband Acceleration Program, again, similar to the Pandemic Response Infrastructure Program, it was designed to be competitive and requires applicants to provide a map of the proposed funding service area to ensure the funding is going where it's needed. The process also includes a public comment process in which we publish the map of the proposed funding areas so that if there's a question of a demonstrated need, that issue can be identified before we've made the awards and make sure that we're appropriately in making investments in our state. Year one, I mentioned this is the 10-year program. Year one projects are just about complete. There were 14 awardees in the initial year, the initial round, and they had 12 months to complete their projects, which is where we're coming up on right now. And those projects are going well. And you see here again, I provided a map of those projects just to give you an idea geographically how we've worked hard to disperse, how the funding has been dispersed across the state. Again, we're mentioning that it's competitive, so there's a good amount of work going on to each one of these to get those projects deployed. We're currently in the midst of taking applications for the second year of the program. As part of the process, we asked thought you'd be interested to know, as part of the process, we asked prospective applicants to give us a letter of intent to apply. The letters of, excuse me, the letters of intent are not mandatory, but they help us manage our workflow and prepare for the evaluation process. We received 50 letters of intent going into the application period with projected funding requests totaling $25 million. That's far in excess of the $5 million available for the round. Applications for the second round of funding are due tomorrow. So if you're working with your communities to apply for this round, hopefully you are just about done because it's due tomorrow. But not to worry, if you're just catching up to the party, we have a year 3 following after that. And that also leads me to talk a little bit briefly, Mr. Chairman and committee, about future funding. I just want to touch on that. I know there's so many things going on, and you may be aware of some and not others. So I wanted to briefly discuss the federal funds that are filling a pipeline for the future for our ability to really close the digital divide, particularly with respect to infrastructure. There is significant funding in the pipeline nationwide, and this includes funding, for example, from the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, which is being discussed right now by the Spark Committee, and I serve as the Vice Chair on the Connectivity Advisory Panel for the Spark Committee. In addition to the Spark funds, there are also funds available through other federally administered programs. The Office of Broadband Development has submitted an application to the National Information and Telecommunications Administration, more commonly known as the NTIA. They have a program called the Broadband Infrastructure Program. It's similar to what we were discussing with the Pandemic Response Infrastructure Program, similar to the Broadband Acceleration Grant Program, pushing infrastructure into areas of need. So we submitted a state application. This was a highly competitive opportunity. Nationwide, total available was $300 million made possible from the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. States and individual entities were eligible to apply for this program. And in our state, we requested and received project proposals from across the state. Our application includes a partnership with 7 internet service providers from across the state and requested grants totaling $13.4 million, covering a total of 10 projects. So there were 7 partners. A couple of the partners had multiple projects in our proposal, which we thought was efficient the way they proposed it. And the award decisions on this program are pending. So we anticipate an award announcement to be made within the next 3 to 4 weeks based on what we're hearing from the NTIA. There's also funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's probably the largest investment in the pipeline by far, actually. That features a $42 billion allocation to be directed to states. And the program, there are a couple of different programs within the infrastructure bill. The kind of meat and potatoes for us is going to be through what's called the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Fund. The formulation for that and the details for how it will flow to our state or to all the states is still being worked out, but I am optimistic that this will represent a significant opportunity to help Kansas close the digital divide so all Kansans can have robust broadband and are able to fully participate in our ever-growing digital economy. I can go in, and again, as I mentioned, that's a high level of where we've been. And below in the appendix, you can see those specific projects, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Stanley. I have a question online from Representative Keither.
Morning, Mr. Adams. How are you?
Good morning.
Been a long time since we've been spending a lot of time together.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple of questions. I don't want to step on Representative Gartner's toes, but I think he brings up a good question about the public fiber, and I'd like you to address that. I'm a little concerned about the money that went for the early projects for hotspots and schools and whatnot. Isn't there other federal funding that should be taking care of that through other entities that have been longstanding supplying funding for schools for internet projects? And the last one is staffing concerns within your broadband program. I think you probably could benefit with one or two more people. Is that a possibility? And that will wrap that up.
Only one or two, you're saying?
Well, well, that was just three. Come on now, you know. Come on.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. So there are a couple of things. Let me try to make sure I answer them, and certainly ping me back here if I miss something. On the schools piece, and you're talking about the pandemic response. Essentially what was going on there, you're absolutely right. There are other funding mechanisms. There were already in place other federal funding mechanisms to support internet connectivity for schools. What we did, particularly in the throes of the pandemic, again, this was where we didn't know it was a new normal at that point. And what we heard loudly from our community, service providers and school districts, was that there were still some students who simply weren't getting covered for a variety of reasons. And so in the grand scheme of things, the allocation that we had, which was 10 million, was actually a small pot of money for the size of the problem, is what was going on. And in fact, I will share with you the other kind of lesson learned in real time that we adapted to very quickly. When we initially set that program up, we wanted to make sure we were being supportive of we're trying to frame our effort to be a little bit more holistic and not just infrastructure, because if you have the infrastructure but no one can use it, the infrastructure is not really being used. That diminishes the use of the investment. So that's why we wanted to make sure that we were do our part to maximize the number of people actually connected. But as we went through the process, we got feedback in real time that said, because we initially focused on, let's provide temporary support for internet subscriptions, because we knew service providers had programs in place, and we just wanted to turbocharge that. So we set about doing that. And we also heard from our school districts that said, yeah, that's great. We think that's a good idea and we can use the help. But what we also really need help with is the devices. Because it's the kids what's happening is we've got this program that you're covering for the subscription. But if you don't have a device and you're trying to use your phone to do your classwork, obviously that's not a desirable situation. So we modified our rules to allow devices to be included. We also funded hotspots. Again, this was Representative Keither. This was really a stopgap measure to make sure we were doing the very best we could to fill the gaps as we could identify them. And subsequently, the service providers have done a lot to pick up the slack. And that's kind of so that's a little bit of what's going on that. The other point you make is true and really close and dear to my heart. There's the Stanley team makes up the broadband office, Melinda Stanley and I, and we made it through these programs stood up on quick timing. And we've also got the acceleration grant program stood up and just now starting to get our stride. We're keeping our heads above water is the truth of the matter. And we see the pipeline is bulging it looks like a light at the end of the tunnel and we feel like it's a train and we're on the tracks. So we know we're going to need some help. Right now, we're depending heavily on consulting support. And I think we will probably continue to need consulting support. But what's going to make sense for us is to have some degree of state capacity to do a good job of managing the federal funding that is about to come down on a rolling basis. So we're very much cognizant that we're going to have to do something in the resource area so that we don't get caught not able to respond appropriately.
Have you, in your budget subcommittee presentation, have you asked for any FYI?
There is a
FYI.
there is. Yeah, I'm not the expert on how the process works, but I know that we put a request in for additional staffing support.
Okay, but do you know how many?
I don't know what was submitted.
Okay, great. Okay. And then the last one is, in case you don't, the third one that I had was about Representative Gardner's idea around public fiber, and would that end up being put into the grant proposal requests? Could that
So,
be? Well,
right. In terms of public fiber, I'm not, Representative Gardner, what are we getting at there, just to make sure I don't go sideways here? What we typically make our funds available for more or less anybody. I mean, within anybody that's a service provider or a municipality or a county government could apply particularly for the infrastructure components. So we don't prohibit on that basis. So we encourage local communities to work with the service providers, because we think that's from a practical standpoint, that's where you're most likely to find cost-effective solutions. But we don't require that. But we really want to make sure that the local communities are driving the identification of the need, so that we know that we're doing a good job rather than relying on some maps. And y'all probably don't want me to talk about maps today.
no.
Oh, come on.
No. Okay, thank you, Stanley. I appreciate your response.
And I'll just interject before going to Representative Gardner. Chairman Finch had to step away, and contrary to what many probably believe, he's not going out to get a copy of the Codebreaker book that I just mentioned, but he had some constituents in town, and so he's going to meet with them, so he apologizes for leaving. But Representative Gardner, your next question.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Hey, Stanley, just a couple of things to follow up on Representative Keither. I think where I was headed was taking what Court's response was to expanding the infrastructure, broadband capabilities across the state, and that would take more fiber in the ground, dark fiber, and we need to be looking at maybe down the road partnerships of adding additional dark fiber and utilizing, I know the Department of Transportation and other departments that do have some dark fiber there, that we can expand that infrastructure. I guess that's where I was headed on that. And if we need additional monies to allocate in a particular program, I think we ought to be looking at that. I think that's where I was headed at that point in time. But let me ask just, Mr. Vice Chair, if I could, a couple quick questions. Number one, I wanted to answer Representative Keither's question about expansion of Stanley's department or workforce in the Commerce Department. They did come to our budget in their Commerce budget for the department asking for $1 million for the expansion of the broadband for Stanley's organization. And that was approved yesterday, and we passed that bill out of Ag and the subcommittee, Representative Keither. So that's headed to appropriations, and hopefully they won't change it because I know you need the extra staff. And I think there was in that budget proposal, not only staff, I hate to say maybe a little additional mapping, Representative Keither, but also the computers, all the equipment that Stanley's going to need to address going forward with the monies we're going to receive from the feds. Then, Mr. Vice Chair, one final question for Stanley. When you look at the infrastructure, I think we're talking from the feds. I've heard the other day, I heard we might end up with $200 and X million for broadband. And what I guess, will there, Stanley, be associated recommendations on how we spend that money? Will it be for underserved areas of the state? Will they dictate the matching grant portion in that? Those are just a few of my questions, because I know we're falling short of 10 million, which it's 5 million going to 10 million. And I was just wondering if, hopefully we can expand that with maybe still the 50% grant.
Right. So this is where it starts to get tricky for us. So we've got to figure out how, because I think you're right. There's going to be, we are hopeful that there will end up being, across the different programs, the pipeline I mentioned, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which is to say probably more than 200, because there's the minimum of $100 million in one of the programs, and we think at least a minimum of $100 million in another. It gets a little fuzzy because they haven't worked out all the details, but the point being the same, that there will be significant dollars to get invested. The trickier, and we are going to have to manage the how to channel the funds based on different rules, because they're different programs, and we're providing this feedback to our federal partners. Trust me on that, because we do think that's going to be a challenge for us. So how to kind of merge different rules for the same purpose. They've already outlined at the federal kind of guidance, and the rules are really stressing, they are putting definitions on what the funding can go for. They define unserved, they define underserved, and the language that we're seeing coming out so far is positive in my mind, because it really stresses more robust broadband, which is what we believe is appropriate. The minimum definition of 25.3 is still in place in some of the programs that are coming, but in other sections of the program, of the funding, they're really looking for it to be higher than that. In fact, what we expect, all of the rules are likely to require any funding that we use or deploy. For infrastructure, at a minimum, would need to be 100 symmetrical, or 100 down, 20 up, if you got a good excuse, if you will, right? Which is to say that there's a really compelling reason that it's cost prohibitive to go with something less. And I would say that it's fair to observe they're really pushing fiber. The expectation is to invest in ways that we don't have to keep reinvesting in areas that we know there's no business case without taxpayer support. So let's not keep having to do it over and over again in these areas that are otherwise just not going to get quality service.
Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. At the outset of your presentation, I didn't see, could you give a quick overview kind of your agency, when it was established, how many staff you do have, kind of what your purpose
Sure.
is?
Yes, I didn't go over that at all. So, well, I've been at the Commerce Department for about 10 years, but it's in the last, in 2020, the Office of Broadband Development was formally established by executive order, and our charter it really codified all of the things that we were trying to get done, which is to be a coordinating entity for the state to drive broadband to every corner of our state, so that we can make sure all rural communities are well connected, and to make sure that we are looking at things in a holistic manner. I mentioned, which is what you hear me refer to, right? There's the infrastructure and there's the ability to access the infrastructure, and making sure that we also are coordinating with other state agencies. Our partnership with KDOT is a leading example of that, because we work really well with them to make sure that we're trying to leverage work that they're doing, for example, on the roads. Well, that's where, when they're digging up, that's an opportunity to put some fiber in. Then we try to encourage applicants to our programs to take that knowledge and put that into their program, so that hopefully they can make a more compelling case to us and for our funding, as an example. The other piece of that is the reason that's a big deal is because it's also touching on how do we interact and channel something that Representative Keither talked about, which is education is a perfectly good example. You know, there's that one hand not knowing what the other hand is doing, funding coming in from different sources. And, you know, we need to kind of get our hands wrapped around how to bring those different funding mechanisms, because I don't know them all personally, but there's some folks in education that probably do know their space. So we're trying to move in that direction, and that's what the role of the office is. And I think I answered most of it. Did I skip a part?
Well, we talked about staffing.
Oh, staffing, right.
We have.
Right. Yeah. So we do have a staff of 2, and I mentioned the consulting support that we have. Comparatively expensive, but it's also we're trying to make good use of that, and we're also trying to. So we have a staff of 2, and we're trying to expand our staffing. Particular areas that I'm concerned about is our ability to validate work that the work is being done properly. We feel good about the projects that we've done, but again, we're doing this many projects and we're about to do this many projects. So we want to make sure we don't lose sight of quality control, if you will, and making sure that awardees are doing what they said they were going to do. The good news is we ultimately have the federal oversight as well, but we need some engineers, we need some technical expertise. I call Court for technical questions right now, and he's going to stop taking my phone calls is what's going to happen, because I'm going to be having too many technical questions for him. So that, and the other, for example, a large amount of funding is going to start coming into digital equity and adoption. So I'm conversing on that very well, but I just can't be pulled in too many different directions. And we're going to need someone to quarterback those efforts, because that alone, potentially north of $100 million in federal funding, because they're saying the same thing. We're putting all of these billions of dollars in infrastructure, and yet we've got a large swath of citizens who effectively don't have access. So what things can be done about that? And that's where the adoption piece kicks in. So we're going to need some support for that. And then I'm a big fan of data. So we're going to need some data analytics. I think we can combine an analytics and a GIS type person to meet the need for that, at least near term. That's what our thoughts were.
On following up to that, so I remember, I think we did a WebEx with you last year in this committee, but so this federal money comes, and as you put in your testimony, it had to be spent by a certain point, and that kind of creates a flurry of activity. So knowing that these things now are recurring, as you said, the pipeline keeps putting more and more money. Do we have some master plan or prioritized areas of need, so that when we, as you say, you request and receive project proposals, are we targeting those areas where we're asking for requests, or are we,
Right.
how we approach that? Thank you.
So it sounds like you were in a meeting I was in yesterday with our consultants talking about the very issue of how to target. We are working through how to be smart about the investments. The challenge, and I didn't go into a lot of the detail. I didn't want to. It was a picking the subjects. We're finalizing a state's broadband strategy that's a little, like I talked about, holistic. It talks about robustness of infrastructure. It talks about digital equity and adoption. It talks about transformative applications in healthcare and education and economic development and so forth. And it talks about Kansas being a leader in connectivity rather than a laggard. So it's meant to be a roadmap. There's some pieces there. There's some things that I'm not quite comfortable that they're explained really well in documents, so we're making some final edits. So we expect to be coming out with that in short order. But we've been active. The key point here is we were in developing our strategy. We were very engaged with stakeholders from those very sectors that I talked about, from education, from healthcare, and with our service provider community. So we've kind of done an inventory of stakeholder engagement to find out how should we target. And I'll just mention to the point that one of the challenges, and there are differing schools of thought about it, how to target. Does the state want to designate specific sub-geographies for investment and not others, right? I don't want to be at the end of the arrow, because if you're not included, then you're probably, trust me when I tell you, what I find fascinating from the data, we know we've got a challenge in the rural areas, and the further west you go, the less dense the population is, which means the business case is more challenging and so on. But trust me when I tell you, I do hear from our friends in very populated areas about connectivity issues. So it actually is a statewide problem. And we're trying to make it, and that's why we envision for the near term, these are going to just continue to be competitive. You show the demonstrated need in a particular area that we can actually quantify is the threshold for anywhere. That's the way we've approached the targeting, is to kind of do the grassroots from the bottom up, tell us where the problems are rather than us tell you where the problems are and here's the money. It's the philosophical way we've approached it.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Any other questions? I don't see any. Oh, Representative Delperdang.
Thank you. Back on your graphs with where it was going through the grant programs, just curiosity, I'm looking at some, and I'm going to pull out one that was roughly a $3 million grant for 12 connections, and then you got a $800,000 grant that provided 2,000 connections. So why the big deviation there? I don't care who it is on here. I'm just.
Yeah, so they're right, because I can tell you generally that's definitely you're gonna find that, right? Because depending on which program we're talking about, but the infrastructure variance in the number of connections, there are a lot of good reasons for some to be not very high and others to be crazy high, if you will, technical phrase court. But what happens is we're actually targeting places, if you would, we're not disqualifying you because it's an expensive connection, because that would defeat the purpose. We're trying to help get some places connected that otherwise wouldn't, and the reason they wouldn't before is because it was expensive. We ran into examples in our connectivity emergency response grants where we awarded an amount, the provider went out and did the work and ran into a whole lot of really difficult ground to bore through, much more than they expected. So their budget was blown. We couldn't help them because we only had, the award is the award. We gave out all our money, so we can't do anything about that. But the cost per premise connected is going to really vary widely on the technology, and then it's going to be environmental conditions that you just can't apply evenly across every circumstance, because the variances, and the service providers can do a better job of explaining why that is, but than I can. But that's essentially the type of things that happen.
And that was kind of the follow-up question. Are we looking at the various technology, or are we focused on, I got to get dark fiber out to that last mile in Finney County or something? You know?
Right. So we have a bias towards the fiber for the reasons I said, because it's proven to be, and Court did a better job than I could about the dark fiber and putting light through it. The way I came to realize why intuitively what's so great about fiber is that it's glass, and it's got the light, it's the spectrum of light, which is infinite, if I remember my college days right, or high school days right. And you can have so many permutations, so the capacity is really big. Ask me something.
Are we looking, if fiber is impractical in a certain area, are we looking at the other technologies?
Right. Sorry about that. Yes.
For example, far west Kansas, maybe on a farm out there, it makes sense to do satellite, but in Garden City, it may make sense to run fiber everywhere.
Right, absolutely. I'm sorry, I blanked on you. That was the point I wanted to get to. Thank you, sir. So what we don't do is say that it has to be one technology or the other. The way we've positioned this is that we're asking you, community, you service provider, to tell us what makes sense. And we're telling you that you're gonna have higher chance of success with a more robust solution. Now, in some cases, that's still gonna be, and we've had applications and we've had discussions along these lines and we encourage this, it's a mix of fiber and fixed wireless. This section here is fiber because we think we can make it work from a business standpoint. And don't forget, the other part of the challenge in our reaching all of the communities that we need to reach is we're supporting the infrastructure, not the capital cost, not the operating costs. So somebody's committing to operate where they build. So we recognize that there may be a mixed solution, and that's how we try to not play favorites on the technology by counting on the folks who know it best to make the recommendations and application.
Other questions from anyone? I've got a couple, Stanley. Knowing that at some point Spark funding will be exhausted and doled out, are there thoughts from your department of 2 people right now that what happens after that? I know you talked about a master plan looking forward, but once this initial glut of funding expires, what next?
So, interestingly enough, the time horizon for the funding that we're talking about in the pipeline is 5 years. So, I haven't really thought a lot about past 5 years yet. So I think if we can be successful in closing this gap once and for all, I do think the funding depends on what your assumptions are, right? We've got to figure out a way to take the funding that's directed to the state and how to line that up. The challenge is more complicated because we also need to figure out how to apply the funding that the state has that it's available with local community funding, because local communities are also getting funding, federal funding, that can go towards broadband. And what we're trying to figure out is how can we best partner in a co-investing way so that it does add up to the level of investment to actually close up, to eliminate the gap in the first place. I think we're going to have to feel our way through how close do we get. In a couple of years, we'll have a better idea, I think. I tend to be optimistic generally. Devil's in the details. We'll have to kind of feel our way through it a little bit, is what I'd say.
And Cord kind of mentioned this in his presentation, but on maintenance of a system once it's installed, do you see that solely being the providers providing that maintenance, or will there be state assistance in some way?
Right. So I think that's a really good question. It's a bubbling issue, that capital versus operating. Right now, well, for sure, state funding, it's only capital expenditures, and mostly from the federal perspective, it's capital. But I know, and I expect that you're going to start seeing more attention and, frankly, funding going towards how to address the operating costs. I mean, just in talking to the service providers, I know this is going to end up being a bigger concern in the out years, because we can pay for the fiber to get put in the ground, but again, it does come back to somebody's got to be willing to operate the network in areas where there are not a lot of people.
I could see that becoming an issue down the road, but I'm glad you're kind of thinking about that. Just a couple of last fairly minor ones, but you talked about a consulting group that's helping you. Is that located? I know broadband in general across the country is very exciting, so I'm sure there's a lot of companies. Is this a regional or located in Kansas, or
we're working with we've worked with the Recovery Office and the consultant and kind of piggybacking on their procurement. So they're national consulting firms that we're working with, BCG and Wood O'Brien.
Okay.
For now. And, it's an ongoing process to figure out how to make sure we've got the resources in line. And there's an active discussion around how are we going to resource the programs that we know we've got to build based on the criteria we're seeing from the federal level.
Sure, yeah. And one last one. I don't know if any other community members noticed, but on the map of the Broadband Partnership Adoption Grants, BPAG project, that map, I think the indicators for where the projects are located, at least on my copy, are washed out. I just wonder if the color or something was
You're
so
testing
close to
my
the gray.
capabilities to produce a map.
I didn't want to use the M word too much, but
Right. No,
if you could,
we could tweak that, yes.
okay, and
So it's easier to see.
you get it to Susan, she can get out
Yes.
to the committee.
Yes,
so
absolutely. Thank you.
that'd be great. Yeah, Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. A comment based upon capital versus sustaining the network or that piece. I would think, Stanley, I might be completely out there in left field, but before a company bids on a particular project for the capital to get the service in the ground, I would think they would also do a business case to say, okay, how long do I have to maintain this? And they wouldn't bid on it unless they knew that they were receiving at least enough revenue in to maintain it. Now, I might be dreaming about that, but I would hope companies would be doing that.
So if I could add just to your very point, because I think about that when I look at the map, just as an example, if you look at the acceleration grant broadband map at the top of page 3, I look at that and I think this is good because it's, spread around. But I also worry that the applications we receive are going to have that in mind. But it also means that ultimately, I'm worried about not getting any applications from some of these counties. And we aren't at the point now because there's so many, like I mentioned, we've got $5 million in this grant program, and we've got interest for $25 million worth of projects. So that's, it's a nice problem to have in a weird way. But but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to have to figure out how to reach out to some of these counties who are not even having there's not a provider looking at it and saying, yeah, maybe I can make that work. And because I don't want to keep coming up in front of this committee or any other and start catching questions. Well, how come you aren't getting any projects in these particular counties? My answer is going to be because nobody applied. So we're trying to figure out how we can, be proactive on that front too.
Last chance for questions. Anyone? I don't see anyone online. No one here. So Stanley, thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Court, thank you as well. We really appreciate this information. And Stanley, when you do develop the master plan, I'm sure love to have you back and walk it through it with us. And that'd be great. So thanks again to our presenters. Let's see, next week on Tuesday is, I'm going to look at my brain here, over here, Susan. Yes. So we're going to have our Utilities 101 presentation, which will cover both electric and gas, and then also background information from Nick on utility regulations. So anyway, with that, committee, we're adjourned. Have a great day.